She had just saved a child's life. 12 hours in the ER. Scrubs still on. Badge clipped to her chest. She was steps from her car when Officer Mallory pulled in. He didn't ask questions, didn't read the badge. Within 90 seconds, he had slammed a trauma nurse against the hood of her own vehicle. What he didn't know, the cameras were rolling. The witnesses were watching. And the woman he just put hands on was Elijah Bennett's daughter. That parking lot mistake just cost the city $8.5 million. This is that story. The shift had started at 11 in the morning, and it had not been kind. Elijah Bennett had not sat down since 1:30. She had not eaten since the granola bar she kept in her locker for exactly this kind of day. The kind where the waiting room fills faster than it empties, and the radio never goes quiet. And every time you think you can breathe, something new comes through the doors that requires every person on the floor to move at once. 12 hours of that. 12 hours of other people's worst moments arriving in rapid succession and needing someone steady enough to meet them without flinching. Aisha was that person. She had always been that person. It was not something she had decided so much as something she had discovered. First in the Army, where she had served 2 tours as a combat medic and learned that the difference between chaos and catastrophe was usually one calm voice. And then in the years since, in emergency departments across the city, where the same principle applied with different uniforms and higher ceilings. She was 34 years old, and she had spent most of her adult life standing between people and the worst thing that was happening to them. She was good at it. She was very good at it. The last patient of the shift had been a 7-year-old boy brought in by ambulance, his mother running through the doors behind the gurney with the particular expression that parents wear when terror has outpaced their ability to manage it. Aisha had been the one who steadied the situation. Not dramatically. Not with anything that would look significant from the outside. On just the presence of someone who knew what to do and did it, quickly and without panic, until the monitors settled and the room stopped holding its breath. By the time she handed off to the incoming team and signed out, it was 11:23 at night. She changed out of her second set of scrubs. The first had not survived the afternoon, and stood at her locker for a moment longer than she needed to, not thinking about anything specific, just standing, letting the noise of the day settle to the bottom, the way sediment settles in water when you stop disturbing it. It was something she had learned to do in the Army and had never unlearned. You could not carry every hour of a shift like this directly into the next part of your life without it costing you something. So she stood, she let it settle. Then she clipped her badge to her chest, picked up her bag, and walked toward the exit. The corridor that led from the staff wing to the parking lot was long and fluorescent lit and mostly empty at this hour, populated only by the particular quiet of a building that never fully sleeps but does, between midnight and 6, at least lower its voice. A custodian she recognized nodded at her from the far end. She nodded back. 2 nurses from the incoming shift passed her going the other direction, carrying coffee, looking the way everyone looks at the beginning of a night shift, alert in the way that has not yet been tested. She pushed through the exit door, and the night air hit her. It was cool and slightly damp, the particular quality of air that collects in parking structures and outdoor lots after midnight, like carrying the distant sound of the city and nothing else. The parking lot spread out in front of her under the amber wash of the overhead lights, mostly empty at this hour, her gray Honda Accord sitting in its usual spot about 40 feet ahead. She could see it from the door. She had parked in the same row for 3 years because it put her close to the exit and far from the lot's one blind corner, a habit left over from the Army and reinforced by the simple practical wisdom of a woman who paid attention to her surroundings. She started walking. Her badge caught the light as she moved, the St. Mary's Medical Center logo, and her photo ID, and her name. Bennett, Aisha, RN, visible in the amber glow. Her stethoscope hung around her neck where she always forgot to take it off until she got home. Her footsteps were quiet on the asphalt. The lot was still. The city hummed somewhere beyond the perimeter fence, indifferent and continuous, the sound of a place that does not pause for individual exhaustion. 40 feet. 30. The car was right there. She had her keys in her hand when the headlights turned into the lot behind her. The dispatch call came through at 11:19. Suspicious person, staff parking lot, St. Mary's Medical Center. No further description. No reported threat. No complainant name listed, which meant it had come in through the non-emergency line from someone who had seen something through a window or a camera feed and decided it warranted a call without being willing to put their name to it. That happened several times a week in this part of the city. Most of those calls resolved themselves before a unit arrived. The person turned out to be a resident, a delivery driver, someone with a reason to be exactly where they were that the caller had not considered before reaching for the phone. Officer Derek Mallory had been on patrol for 6 of his 11-year career in this district. He knew the statistics on suspicious person calls. He knew how they usually resolved. He ran the call anyway, because the shift had been slow, and because the lot at St. Mary's was on his route, and because 11 years of unchallenged patrol decisions had produced in him a particular relationship with his own instincts, a confidence in them that had long since passed the point where he examined them and arrived at the point where he simply acted on them, the way you stop thinking about how to ride a bicycle and simply ride. He turned into the lot at 11:24. His headlights swept the asphalt and found her immediately, a figure in the amber overhead light, moving toward the far row of vehicles, alone. He ran the image through the filter that 11 years had built without his awareness or consent. The hour, the demographic, the direction of movement, the lot. Each variable fed into a calculation that happened faster than thought and produced a conclusion that was already settled before he had pulled fully into the entrance. He did not process the scrubs. He did not process the badge catching the light as she turned toward his headlights, or the stethoscope, or the lanyard, or any of the accumulated visual evidence of a person who belonged precisely where she was standing. These details existed. They were available to him. He simply did not reach for them, because the conclusion had already been reached by the time they could have mattered, and Mallory was not, at this point in his career, a man who revisited conclusions. He pulled up alongside her and rolled down the window. "Hey, stop right there." Aisha stopped. She turned toward the cruiser fully, her hands visible, by her badge in the direct line of his headlights. She had done this before. Not this exactly, but the version of this that every black woman who grew up as Elijah Bennett's daughter learns to prepare for. The encounter that requires you to be simultaneously cooperative and precise, to give the other person every possible off-ramp while documenting, in the back of your mind, every second of the exchange. "Good evening, officer," she said. Her voice was level. "I just finished my shift. I work here." Mallory got out of the cruiser. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with the particular physical confidence of someone who had never had to develop the conversational tools that smaller or less armored people learn out of necessity. And he approached her with his thumbs hooked in his belt in the manner of a man who understood his own physical presence as a form of communication and was comfortable letting it speak first. He looked at her. He looked at the car behind her. He looked at the lot. He did not look at the badge. "Got a call about a suspicious person out here," he said. "You got ID?" "It's right here." Aisha indicated the badge on her chest. "Elijah Bennett. I'm a registered nurse, emergency department. I've been here since 11 this morning." Mallory's eyes moved to the badge and off it again in the same motion, the glance of a man checking a box rather than reading information. "You got a driver's license? Something I can run?" This was the moment. The first one. And the small one that anyone watching the security footage would later identify as the point at which the encounter could have ended. A license produced, a name run, a clean record returned, a brief apology for the inconvenience, 2 people going their separate ways into the night. 12 seconds, maybe 15. That was all it would have cost. Aisha reached slowly into her bag. Mallory's hand moved to his belt. not to his radio. She saw it. She registered it with the same systematic precision she had applied to every other second of this encounter, and she made the calculation that her father had spent 20 years teaching her to make. The calculation about which kind of correct is survivable and which kind is not. She produced the license and held it out without changing her expression or her posture or the level quality of her voice. Mallory took it without looking at it. "Step over here from me," he said, moving toward the front of her car, away from the vehicle. "Officer, I've shown you my hospital badge and my license. I've explained that I work here. Can you tell me what—" "I'm not going to ask you twice," Mallory said. And something in his voice had shifted, the way a room shifts when a door closes and the air pressure changes. The procedural tone was gone. What replaced it was flatter and more certain, the voice of a man who had stopped having a conversation and started executing a decision that had already been made. "Step to the front of the vehicle. Now." The parking lot was very quiet. Somewhere above them, mounted to the light pole at the lot's northeast corner, a security camera completed its slow rotation and settled on the front row. It was still recording. Aisha moved to the front of the car. She did it slowly, and she did it with both hands visible, and she did it because 12 years of her father's voice lived in her muscle memory alongside 2 tours of combat medicine. And both of those things were telling her the same thing in this moment, that compliance was not agreement, and that the most important thing she could do right now was stay in the frame of every camera she had already identified in this lot, and make sure that everything that happened next happened in the light. She had counted 3 cameras since Mallory pulled in, the one on the northeast light pole, the one mounted above the exit ramp, the one on the corner of the building above the staff entrance, angled downward toward the first 2 rows of parking. She knew where they were because she walked past them every day, Sunday twice a day, for 3 years. And Elijah Bennett was the kind of person who noticed things and retained them without deciding to. The Army had not taught her that. It had simply confirmed it. She stood at the front of her car with her hands at her sides, open, and she waited. Mallory came around the hood. He had her license in his hand, and he had still not looked at it. He stopped 3 feet from her and looked at her instead, with the evaluative stillness of a man deciding what category this moment belongs in, whether it resolves quietly or whether it becomes something that requires the next step in a sequence he had run many times before. "You're saying you work here," he said. "I do work here. I've shown you my hospital badge and my driver's license, and I've told you my name and my department. I just finished a 12-hour shift." She kept her voice at the same register it had been since the beginning, even, unhurried. "If you need to verify that, the charge nurse on the incoming team can confirm my hours. Her name is Patricia Osei. She came on at 11. I don't need you to tell me how to do my job. I'm not doing that. I'm giving you information that verifies what I've said." The distinction was precise, and Mallory heard it as challenge. She could see it in the shift of his jaw, the same micro-expression she had learned to read in forward operating bases and trauma bays and every other environment, where a man's ego and his authority occupy the same body, and the wrong word collapses the distance between them. She had not said anything wrong. She had said something accurate, and in this particular moment, those were not the same thing. "Turn around," Mallory said, hands on the hood. "Am I being detained?" "Turn around." She turned. She placed her hands on the hood of her own car, on the gray metal that still held some warmth from the engine, and she looked straight ahead at the parking lot and the perimeter fence and the amber light falling across everything, and she began to do the thing that the Army had made automatic in her and that no discharge papers had been able to undo. She began to record. Not with a device, with herself. The time, she had checked her watch at 11:23 when she exited the building, and Mallory had arrived within 2 minutes of that, so it was approximately 11:25. The location, front of her vehicle, first row, northeast quadrant of the lot, a camera coverage confirmed on 3 sides, Her physical state. No injuries at this point. Hands in contact with the hood, standing upright. No physical contact made yet by the officer. His position, behind her and to her left, approximately 2 feet of distance. His hand movement she could not see, but could track by sound. She was cataloging the scene before she treated it. It was the first thing they taught you. Record first. Then respond. What happened next took less than 4 seconds and would be reviewed in courtrooms and depositions and oversight hearings for the following 18 months. Mallory reached for her arm, not to guide her. The grip came with a torque behind it, the rotational force of someone converting a hold into a redirect. And before the motion had completed itself, Aisha was no longer standing at the hood, but against it, her left cheekbone making contact with the metal, the full forward weight of a decision that had nothing to do with procedure, and everything to do with the specific way certain men respond when they feel themselves losing a conversation they believed they had already won. The stethoscope swung forward on its own momentum and struck the asphalt. The sound it made was small and plastic and final. Aisha cataloged that too. Left cheekbone, point of contact, hood of vehicle. Pressure applied to upper arm, rotational force, probable bruising. Timestamp approximately 11:26. As she held on to each detail with the focused deliberateness of a person who understands that memory is evidence, and evidence is the only weapon she has access to right now, and she is not going to drop it. She did not resist. She did not cry out. She kept her hands where they were visible, and she breathed, and she recorded. At the top of the exit ramp, 30 feet away, 3 nurses from the incoming night shift had stopped walking. They stood with their lanyards and their coffee cups, and they watched what was happening in the amber light of the first row, and none of them moved because they were each making the same rapid calculation about what moving would accomplish and what it would cost, and whether the cameras they could also see from where they were standing were doing what cameras in hospital parking lots were installed to do. They were. The press release went out at 4:47 in the morning. Aisha knew this because she was awake at 4:47 in the morning, sitting at her kitchen table with an ice pack against her left cheekbone and her phone face up beside her coffee cup, and the notification arrived the way bad news always arrives in the digital age, without warning, without ceremony, as a small rectangle of light in the dark that changes everything it illuminates. The Metropolitan Police Department's Office of Public Affairs had issued a statement regarding an incident at St. Mary's Medical Center. The statement described an officer responding to a suspicious person call in the staff parking lot at approximately 11:20 p.m. It described a subject who had been uncooperative and who had resisted the officer's lawful attempts to verify her identity. It described a situation that had been professionally managed and safely de-escalated. It used the word professional twice and the word safety once, and it did not use the word nurse at any point, because the word nurse would have introduced a context that the statement was constructed specifically to exclude. Aisha read it twice. Then she set her phone face down on the table and sat with the ice pack and the silence of her apartment at 5 in the morning and let herself feel, for exactly the length of time she decided to allow it, the specific exhaustion of a person who has spent an entire life doing everything correctly and is watching it be rewritten in real time by people who were not present and are not accountable and will face no consequence for the rewriting. She allowed herself 90 seconds. Then she picked up the phone and called her father. The counter-complaint had been filed at 2:14 a.m., while she was still at the precinct giving her statement. She did not know this yet when she called Elijah, but he did, because Elijah Bennett had been practicing civil rights law for 40 years in this city, and he had a relationship with the rhythms of institutional self-protection, the way a sailor has a relationship with weather. He could read what was coming from the quality of what was already here. He had been awake since 3. He was already dressed when she called. By the time he arrived at her apartment, the local morning news had moved the story onto its 7 o'clock segment. She watched it with her hands around a second cup of coffee she was not drinking. The anchor described an altercation in a hospital parking lot. There was a brief clip of the department's public affairs officer at a podium confirming that an investigation was underway and that the officer involved had been placed on administrative leave as a matter of standard procedure, a phrase that meant precisely nothing and was designed to. There was no footage from the parking lot. There was no mention of a hospital badge or a 12-hour shift or a stethoscope on asphalt. There was a chyron at the bottom of the screen that read, "Officer cleared in hospital lot confrontation." And Aisha looked at that chyron for a long moment before she turned the television off. The hospital's legal team called at 8:15. She was told, in the careful measured language of institutional caution, that the hospital valued her service and her well-being and was taking the matter seriously, and that given the complexity of the situation and the counter-complaint that had been filed, it might be in her personal interest to consider whether a negotiated resolution might provide a more certain outcome than a protracted legal process. The person saying this was not unkind. He was simply a man whose job was to protect the institution from the consequences of things that happened on its property. And he was doing that job with the practiced diplomacy of someone who had done it many times before. Aisha thanked him and ended the call. She was still sitting at the kitchen table when Elijah let himself in with the key she had given him 6 years ago and had never once asked him to use at 6 in the morning, which meant he had never used it at 6 in the morning until today. He was 63 years old, silver at the temples, with the particular physical presence of a man who had spent 4 decades walking into rooms that did not want him there and had learned to enter them anyway, as though the resistance were a weather condition rather than a verdict. He set his briefcase by the door. He sat down across from her without taking off his coat. He looked at the ice pack she had set on the table beside her coffee. He looked at her face. He did not say anything for a moment. She told him everything. The call, the badge, the questions she had answered, the hands, the stethoscope on the ground, the 3 nurses at the top of the ramp, the cameras she had counted. She told him in the same sequential, documented order she had told the statement officer at 2 in the morning, because that was how her mind organized events that it needed to survive. Linearly. With timestamps. With evidence. She did not cry while she told him. She had already decided she was not going to do that here, not because there was anything wrong with it, but because she needed to be clear right now, and she needed him to hear everything, and she would deal with the rest of it later, alone, in her own time. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. Elijah looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at his daughter, at the bruise developing under her left eye, and the badge still sitting on the table where she had set it when she came in, and the stethoscope coiled beside it, which she had picked up from the asphalt herself because no one else had picked it up for her. He folded his hands on the table. "The settlement," he said. "Not a question. They want me to consider it." Elijah nodded slowly, the nod of a man processing something he already knew was coming and had already decided what to do about. He was quiet for another moment. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a garbage truck moved through the street in the gray early morning, indifferent and mechanical. "Not a chance," he said. 2 words. Quiet as a door closing. Absolute as anything Aisha had ever heard him say in 40 years of watching him say things that mattered. She put both hands around her coffee cup and looked at her father across the kitchen table as the morning came in through the window behind him. And for the first time since 11:26 the previous night, she exhaled completely. The subpoena was filed on a Monday morning and acknowledged by the department's legal division on Wednesday afternoon, which was itself a statement, not a response, time mandated by procedure, but a response time chosen to communicate that the pace of this process would be set by the people who controlled the process and not by the people requesting things from it. Elijah had expected this. He had built 2 extra weeks into his timeline before the subpoena was filed, because 40 years of civil rights litigation in this city had taught him that the first thing an institution does when it needs to protect itself is slow everything down to the speed at which urgency becomes exhaustion, and exhaustion becomes settlement. And he had seen it so many times, and in so many variations, that he had stopped experiencing it as frustration and had arrived at something more useful, a flat, patient recognition that this was the terrain and that the terrain was not going to change, and that the only available response was to know it better than the people who had built it. The department's formal response to the subpoena arrived on a Friday. Elijah read it at his desk, with his reading glasses on, and his coffee going cold beside him, and the expression of a man encountering a document that contains no surprises and is no less serious for that. The security footage from the St. Mary's Medical Center staff parking lot, the response stated, had been stored on a municipal server maintained under a shared services agreement between the department and the city's infrastructure division. 3 days after the incident, the server had experienced a corruption event of undetermined origin. The file containing the relevant footage had been rendered unrecoverable. The backup copy, maintained under standard protocol on a secondary drive in the same server cluster, had been overwritten during the corruption event. The department expressed regret for the technical failure and confirmed that it had no further copies of the footage in its possession. Elijah set the document on his desk. He had seen this before. Not this document. This document was new, with this department's letterhead and this incident's date, and this particular combination of technical language assembled to describe a loss that was, on its face, entirely plausible, and, in his experience, almost never accidental. He had seen the shape of it before, the corruption event that arrives within 72 hours, the backup that fails simultaneously, the regret expressed in language so passive and so procedural that the regret itself becomes a form of insulation. We are sorry this happened, and our sorrow is documented, and our documentation of our sorrow is evidence of our good faith. He had seen it in 3 prior cases across his career, in 2 different cities, involving 2 different departments. And in each case, the footage had been critical, and in each case, the footage had been lost, and in each case, the department had expressed regret. In one of those cases, the plaintiff had settled. In the second, the case had been dismissed for insufficient evidence. In the third, Elijah had won anyway, through witness testimony and a single photograph taken by a bystander on a disposable camera. And the victory had cost 4 years, and more than the plaintiff had expected to spend, and had produced a settlement that the department paid without admitting liability, which meant they had paid and learned nothing simultaneously. He took off his reading glasses and set them on top of the response letter and sat for a moment in his office, which was a room full of 40 years of exactly this, files and transcripts and depositions, and the accumulated paperweight of a career spent inside the gap between what institutions said they were and what they did when no one was watching. Or when they believed no one was watching. He called his paralegal, a 26-year-old named Dara Osei, who had been with his office for 14 months and who had, in that time, demonstrated a talent for finding the specific thing that was not supposed to be findable, that Elijah had stopped attributing to luck after the 3rd time it happened. He told her about the response. He told her what he needed, not the footage itself. The department had made that unavailable and had documentation of its unavailability, and the documentation was clean. What he needed was anything adjacent to the footage, anything that touched the system the footage had lived in. Maintenance records, IT logs, server access histories, installation records for the camera system itself. Anything that established the infrastructure around the missing thing, because in Elijah's experience, the missing thing was never the only thing, and the people who removed it were rarely careful enough about everything else. Dara called him back at 8:40 in the evening. She had been in the hospital's internal IT maintenance records, not the department's records, which the subpoena had already exhausted, but St. Mary's own system logs, which were the hospital's property and which the department's response letter had not addressed because the officer responsible for filing the suppression request had directed his attention entirely at the municipal server and had not considered that the hospital, 18 months earlier, had installed its own independent backup infrastructure as part of a facility-wide security upgrade. The system was a cloud-based archive. It operated on a separate network from the municipal server. It had not been included in the department's subpoena because the department had not known it existed. It archived automatically every 72 hours. The incident had occurred 11 days ago. There are 3 backup cycles in the archive since the night of the incident, Dara said. Her voice had the specific quality of controlled precision over considerable internal excitement. The footage is in all 3 of them. Elijah picked up his pen. Get me the access request drafted tonight, he said. I want it filed when they open in the morning. The footage entered evidence on a Tuesday, and by Thursday, the department had changed its strategy entirely. This was not a surprise to Elijah. He had watched the shift happen before. The moment when suppression fails, and an institution pivots from denying what occurred to reframing what it meant. It was a different operation requiring different tools, and the department's legal team was competent enough to understand that the moment the backup footage became undeniable, the only remaining variable was the jury's interpretation of it. So they stopped arguing about what happened in the parking lot and started arguing about who Elijah Bennett was and what kind of person would interpret that interaction the way she had interpreted it. The union's first filing described Aisha's military background not as a credential, but as a context. The language was careful and calibrated. Phrases like heightened threat response and non-standard perception of authority that were designed to plant a seed without stating a claim directly. The implication, assembled from the careful arrangement of neutral-sounding words, was that a woman with combat training might experience a routine police interaction differently than an ordinary civilian, that her perception of aggression might not reflect the officer's intent, that the gap between what happened and what she believed happened was a function of her history rather than his conduct. The selectively edited audio appeared in a local news segment 4 days after the footage entered evidence. Someone had provided it. The segment ran 93 seconds of the parking lot exchange that began after Mallory's instruction to move to the front of the vehicle, cutting the preceding 2 minutes entirely. The badge presentation, the license, the questions Aisha had answered with precise and documented cooperation. What remained, stripped of its context, was a woman who sounded resistant and an officer who sounded measured, and the chyron beneath it read, "Bodycam audio raises questions in Bennett case." Elijah filed a motion and issued a statement, and did both with the composed efficiency of a man who had expected exactly this and had prepared for it. But the damage that kind of segment does not respond to legal motions. It responds to time and counter-narrative and the sustained attention of a public that has other things demanding its sustained attention simultaneously. The department's union had resources and patience and a communications infrastructure that had been managing exactly this kind of situation for years. Elijah had the truth and the footage, and a daughter who was currently suspended from her nursing position pending the outcome of the counter-complaint, which meant that the person at the center of this case was sitting at home watching her career be dismantled in slow motion, while the people responsible for dismantling it went to work every morning in the same building and drew the same paychecks. The case was narrowing. Elijah could feel it the way you feel a current pulling, not dramatically, not all at once, but consistently, in one direction, and requiring more effort to resist with each passing week. His paralegal was named Dara Osei. She was 26 years old and had been with the firm for 14 months, and she had a relationship with records requests that Elijah could only describe as forensic. She filed them the way other people breathed, continuously and without apparent effort. And she read what came back with the patience of someone who understood that what an institution chooses not to include in a document is frequently more informative than what it does. She called him at 2:17 in the morning on a Wednesday in the 4th month of the case. He answered on the second ring because he had learned, in 40 years of this work, that calls at 2 in the morning from people who are still working at 2 in the morning are the calls that matter. "Or Jerome Watkins," she said. "Complaint filed 3 years ago. Professional Standards Case Number 2, 021-CR-0047. Opened March, closed June. Finding: unsubstantiated." Elijah sat up. "What was the complaint?" Dara told him. Jerome Watkins was 38 years old and drove a delivery truck for a regional logistics company that covered a 6-county route. He had been working a late drop on a Thursday evening 3 years earlier when he had been pulled over in a commercial district 4 blocks from St. Mary's Medical Center by Officer Derek Mallory, responding to a dispatch call describing a suspicious vehicle. Jerome had his commercial license, his company ID, his delivery manifest, and in the specific institutional knowledge of a black man in his late 30s who had been driving trucks through this city for 11 years and understood that certain kinds of stops required a particular kind of patience. He had presented everything. He had answered every question. And then, in a commercial district at 10:45 at night, with no witnesses and no cameras, something had happened that left Jerome Watkins with a bruised wrist, a torn shirt collar, and a complaint that he filed the following morning at the department's professional standards office with the handwritten thoroughness of a man who knew that thoroughness was his only resource. The complaint had been reviewed. A finding had been issued. The finding was unsubstantiated, for which in the specific language of professional standards review meant not that it didn't happen, but that there was insufficient evidence to confirm that it did, a distinction that sounds technical and functions as a disposal mechanism, clean, documented, and final. Jerome Watkins had no attorney. He had no footage. He had no paralegal working at 2 in the morning on his behalf. He had a complaint number and a closure letter, and the experience of having told the truth to an institution that had already decided what to do with it before he finished speaking. His name had been in the professional standards archive for 3 years, in a closed file, in a case numbered and shelved and accessible only through the kind of records request that someone had to know to file. Dara had known to file it. Elijah held the phone and looked at the window of his study and the dark street below it, and the street light making its small orange circle on the wet pavement. And he thought about Jerome Watkins driving his route for 3 years with a closure letter and no resolution. And he thought about Aisha sitting at her kitchen table with an ice pack at 5 in the morning, watching her career being taken apart by people who were counting on the case being about one night in one parking lot. It was not about one night in one parking lot. It never had been. Aisha was not the origin of this pattern. She was the first person who had been in the wrong place when Mallory made this particular decision, who had also been in the right place, in the light, on camera, with witnesses, fought and with a father who knew what a records request was and a paralegal who knew how to read one. Jerome Watkins had driven a delivery truck through the same city for 3 more years, while the file sat closed. That was the case. That had always been the case. And now Elijah had it. He told Dara to send him everything she had and to find Jerome Watkins a phone number before morning. Jerome Watkins drove the same 6-county route on the Tuesday that Dara found his number, and on the Wednesday that Elijah called it, and on the Thursday that he sat in the passenger seat of his truck in a rest stop outside the city and listened to a civil rights attorney explain who he was and why he was calling. And when Elijah finished, Jerome was quiet for long enough that Elijah checked the line to make sure it was still connected. It was. "I filed that complaint myself," Jerome said finally. "Wrote it out by hand. Took it in person. They gave me a case number and a form letter 6 weeks later that said there wasn't enough evidence." He paused. "I had a bruised wrist and a torn collar. And my word, that wasn't enough evidence." Elijah told him about Aisha, and he told him about the parking lot and the cameras and the counter complaint and the edited audio and the 4 months since. He told him about the footage that had survived because of a backup server the department hadn't known to suppress. He told him, carefully and without overpromising, what Jerome's testimony could mean for the case, and what the case could mean beyond itself. Jerome listened to all of it without interrupting. "What do you need from me?" he said. Jerome had not spent the 3 years since the complaint waiting for resolution. He was not that kind of man, or had learned not to be, which amounted to the same thing. He had filed the complaint because it was the true and correct thing to do, and when the system processed it and returned it to him as insufficient, he had put the closure letter in a folder in the drawer of his desk at home and continued driving his route, because the route was how he paid his mortgage and fed his 2 daughters and maintained the structure of a life that Mallory's decision in that commercial district had shaken, but had not ultimately been allowed to collapse. It had cost him things that did not appear in the closure letter. The month after the incident, he had requested a route change from his dispatcher, citing personal reasons, rerouting himself away from the 4-block radius around St. Mary's Medical Center, where it had happened. The request had been granted without question and had cost him 11 minutes of additional drive time per shift, which over 3 years amounted to a number he had never calculated, because calculating it would have required him to sit with what it represented, that he had rearranged his working life around a man who had never once rearranged anything around him. He had not told his wife the full account of what happened until 2 months after the closure letter arrived. He had told her a version, the stop, the questions, the roughness of it, but not the complete version, not the specific details that he had written in the complaint, and that he had not been able to say out loud to someone he needed to still believe the world was navigable. His older daughter was 9 at the time. She was 12 now. She had never been told anything. The department's response to Jerome's emergence as a witness followed the script that Elijah had anticipated and explained to Aisha before it happened, so that when it happened, it would arrive as a known thing rather than a new wound. They obtained Jerome's driving record, 2 minor violations in 11 years, both resolved. They obtained his credit history. They contacted his employer under the pretense of a routine verification. They filed a motion arguing that the 3-year gap between the original complaint and Jerome's appearance as a witness indicated coaching and coordination rather than corroboration, using the word manufactured twice in a single paragraph. Jerome read the motion when Elijah's office sent it to him. He read it at his kitchen table on a Sunday morning while his daughters were still asleep. He read it with the particular steadiness of a man who has already survived the thing they are using against him and understands that the existence of the attack confirms the value of what he has. He called Elijah and said he was still in. The first time Jerome Watkins and Elijah Bennett were in the same room was a Thursday morning in the corridor outside Courtroom 4 on the 2nd floor of the federal courthouse, 40 minutes before a pre-trial hearing. Elijah's firm had arranged for them to arrive at the same time, but had not orchestrated anything beyond that, understanding that some things do not benefit from arrangement. The corridor was long and fluorescent lit, and populated with the particular human traffic of a building where serious things happen continuously. Attorneys with briefcases, clerks with files, people sitting in plastic chairs along the wall with the expression of people waiting for something important that has not yet been given a time. Aisha saw him before he saw her. She recognized him from the photograph Dara had included in the file summary, a man in his late 30s in a company jacket, broad-shouldered, with the specific physical bearing of someone who carries things for a living. He was sitting in one of the plastic chairs, with his hands clasped between his knees, looking at the floor in the manner of someone organizing their thoughts rather than avoiding the room. She sat down in the chair beside him. He looked up. Neither of them said anything immediately. They sat in the fluorescent corridor with the foot traffic moving around them and the weight of what they held between them, not the same weight. Not from the same angle, but the same origin, the same man, the same institution's decision that what they had experienced was not enough. He did the same thing to you, Jerome said. Not a question. He did, Aisha said. Jerome nodded slowly. He looked back at the floor for a moment. Then he looked at her directly, with the clear, level gaze of a man who has decided something and is done revising it. "I have 2 daughters," he said, 9 and 12. He paused. "I've been thinking about that a lot. The 12-year-old, she's going to be driving in 4 years." Aisha looked at him. "I'm going to testify," he said, simply, as though it were not the most important sentence he had said in 3 years. "I just wanted you to know why." The trial opened on a Monday in November, and the courtroom was full in the way that courtrooms are full when a city has been watching something for 18 months and has finally been given a room in which to sit with it. Elijah did not open with a speech. He opened with a question, addressed to the jury before a single witness had been called, that he then spent 11 days answering. The question was simple. He asked them to pay attention to the gap, not the gap between what Officer Mallory intended and what occurred, not the gap between his account and Aisha's account, but the gap between what the documentation said and what the evidence showed. He told them that gap was the whole case. Then he sat down and began to build it. Mallory took the stand on the second day. He was represented by the union's senior litigation attorney, a careful and experienced man who had prepared his client thoroughly for the questions he knew were coming and could not, despite that preparation, fully account for the footage. Mallory testified in the measured, procedural register of a man reciting a document he had memorized. The dispatch call, the suspicious person, the subject's failure to cooperate, the minimal necessary force applied in accordance with departmental guidelines. He used the phrase "in accordance with departmental guidelines" 4 times in 40 minutes. Each time he used it, Elijah wrote something on his notepad and did not look up. Then Elijah stood. He did not begin with the footage. He began with the report. He walked Mallory through his own documentation of the incident, line by line, each with the patient, methodical precision of someone who has read the document so many times, he knows where every load-bearing word is and exactly how much weight it will hold before it fails. The report stated that the subject had refused to produce identification. The footage showed Aisha presenting her hospital badge within 20 seconds of Mallory's approach. Mallory said he had not seen it clearly in the low light. Elijah produced the lot's lighting maintenance record, confirming that all overhead fixtures in the first row had been operational and fully illuminated at 11:24 p.m. on the night in question. The report stated that the subject had made a sudden movement toward the officer. Elijah asked Mallory to describe the movement. Mallory described it. Elijah asked him to locate that movement in the footage. Mallory watched the footage on the monitor beside the witness stand for a long moment. He said the camera angle made it difficult to assess. Elijah asked him to identify any point in the 11 minutes and 43 seconds of footage where the subject moved toward the officer rather than away from or stationary relative to him. Mallory watched the screen. The courtroom waited. He could not identify one. The report language came last. Elijah placed 2 documents side by side on the evidence display, Mallory's report from the St. Mary's parking lot and the professional standards case file from Jerome Watkins's complaint 3 years earlier, specifically the officer's written response to the complaint allegations. He read 2 passages aloud, one from each document. The phrasing was not similar. It was identical. Not in the way that bureaucratic language tends toward similarity through shared training and template usage, but identical in the specific, particular way that a sentence is identical when it has been copied from itself. The same word, choices, the same clause structure, the same 3-word description of subject behavior that appeared in both documents as though the subjects were interchangeable, which was, Elijah said quietly, setting the documents down. Precisely the point. Mallory said he did not recall the specific language of either report. Elijah thanked him and sat down. Chief Roland Voss took the stand on the 6th day. He was 61 years old, 17 years in the position, with the composed institutional authority of a man who has testified in enough proceedings to have developed testimony as a professional skill. He answered questions about the professional standards review process with a precision and thoroughness that demonstrated, with each additional answer, exactly how well-designed the process was for the purpose it actually served. He explained the evidentiary threshold for a substantiated finding. He explained the documentation requirements. He explained the timeline from complaint receipt to closure determination. He explained all of it with the fluency of someone who had built the system and understood every room in it. Elijah asked him how many complaints filed against Officer Mallory in the preceding 6 years had resulted in a substantiated finding. Voss consulted his documentation. 0. Elijah asked him how many had been filed. Voss consulted his documentation again. 7. The courtroom was quiet. Elijah asked no further questions. The footage went to the jury on the 8th day. The full recording. 11 minutes and 43 seconds from the moment Mallory's cruiser turned into the northeast entrance of the St. Mary's staff parking lot to the moment Aisha was released and stood alone in the first row with her hands at her sides and her stethoscope on the ground, 6 feet away. The jury watched it on a monitor large enough that every person in the box could see the timestamp in the corner, advancing in real time. They watched Aisha present her badge. They watched Mallory's eyes move across it and away. They watched the license produced and held and pocketed without examination. They watched the instruction to move to the front of the vehicle. They watched her compliance, measured and deliberate and completely unambiguous. They watched the moment Mallory's hand moved. They watched the stethoscope fall. Nobody in the jury box moved for the remaining 4 minutes of the recording. When it ended and the screen went dark, Juror 7, a middle-aged woman in the second seat who had taken careful notes throughout the preceding 8 days, looked down at her notepad and did not write anything. She simply looked at it, as though she was checking whether what she had written across 8 days of testimony still meant what she had believed it meant when she wrote it. It did. It meant more. The jury returned on the 11th day at 2:14 in the afternoon. Aisha was sitting at the plaintiff's table with her hands folded in front of her when the foreperson stood. She had been sitting in that chair for 11 days, and she had done it the same way each day, straight-backed, present, wearing the same quality of composed attention she brought to a trauma bay, the attention of someone who understands that what is happening in this room matters, and that mattering requires witness. She had not performed distress for the gallery, and she had not performed confidence for the jury. She had simply been there every day as herself, which was the only thing Elijah had asked her to do from the beginning, and the hardest thing she had ever been asked. The foreperson read the finding: liability established, damages awarded, saw $8.5 million. The number landed in the courtroom, and the gallery responded, and Elijah placed his hand briefly over Aisha's on the table, and she nodded once and looked straight ahead, because there were cameras present, and because what she felt in that moment was not the thing the cameras were waiting to capture, not triumph, not relief, not the clean, bright satisfaction of a wrong made right, but something older and more complicated, a feeling that had no simple name and that she had no intention of simplifying for an audience. She looked at the third row. Jerome Watkins was sitting in a charcoal suit that was pressed with the specific precision of someone who had pressed it himself, carefully the night before, because the occasion required it, and because that was the kind of man he was. He was looking at the foreperson. When the number was read, his expression did not change dramatically. His jaw moved slightly. He blinked once. Then he looked down at his hands for a moment, in the way a person looks at their hands when they are absorbing something they have been waiting 3 years to absorb and need a second to confirm that it is real. He had driven 4 hours that morning. He had arranged with his dispatcher to take the day without pay because the route didn't cover itself, and neither did the courthouse. And Jerome Watkins did not have the kind of financial margin that made either of those things uncomplicated. He had told his wife he would be home for dinner, and he had not told his daughters where he was going, because there was a version of this day in which the jury came back wrong, and he did not want to have to explain that version to a 12-year-old who was 4 years from driving. He looked up from his hands and across the courtroom and found Aisha's eyes and held them for a moment. She nodded at him. He nodded back. That was all. It was enough. The consent decree was filed within 60 days. The department's use of force policy was rewritten under federal oversight, with specific provisions governing the documentation requirements for suspicious person stops, the mandatory review of badge and identification credentials before any physical contact, and the creation of an independent civilian board with subpoena authority over the professional standards complaint review process, the first such board in the department's history, with the specific mandate to audit closed, unsubstantiated findings dating back 7 years. Roland Voss announced his retirement the week the consent decree was finalized. The announcement described a decision made after careful reflection and in the interest of allowing new leadership to implement the changes ahead. It did not mention Jerome Watkins. It did not mention Elijah Bennett. It did not mention the 7 complaints filed against one officer across 6 years that had each passed through the review process he had designed and emerged without a finding. Mallory was terminated the same week. His union filed a grievance. The grievance was reviewed under the new oversight structure. The grievance was denied. Aisha gave her statement on the courthouse steps at 4:30 in the November light that was already going low and amber over the city. There were cameras and reporters and people who had followed the case from the parking lot footage to this afternoon, and she stood in front of all of them and said what she had written and rewritten in the weeks before the verdict, not for them, but for herself, so that she would know exactly what she meant when she said it. She said that a parking lot should be safe for every nurse who walks across it at midnight. She said that a hospital badge should mean something to the person it is presented to. She said that $8.5 million was not justice for what happened to her in that parking lot on a Thursday night in November after a 12-hour shift. It was the floor, the minimum, the first thing that had to be true before any of the other things could follow. She said that Jerome Watkins had filed a complaint 3 years ago and had been told it was nothing, and that she needed the people listening to understand that the floor they were standing on today had been built in part by a man in a delivery truck who had told the truth to an institution that disposed of it and had told it anyway. She did not say she forgave anyone. She did not say the system had worked. She said there was more work. She said there was always more work. And she said she was going back to the emergency department on Monday, and she was going to do her job, and the people responsible for this department were now going to do theirs under conditions that made doing otherwise considerably more difficult and considerably more costly. Then she walked back through the courthouse doors. Inside, Elijah was already on the phone, standing in the corridor with his briefcase at his feet and his coat still on, speaking in the low-focused register of a man moving from one thing directly to the next. He looked up when she came through the doors. He covered the phone for a moment. "There's a case in Riverside," he said. "Similar pattern, different department." He held her eyes. "I told them we'd talk next week." Aisha looked at her father, at the briefcase on the floor and the phone in his hand, and the 40 years of this work that lived in his face and that she understood. Standing here, she was now fully inside of, in a way that the parking lot had made permanent. "Make it Thursday," she said. Elijah went back to his call. Aisha walked down the corridor toward the exit, toward the amber November light coming through the glass doors, toward the city that was still there and still moving and still full of parking lots and nurses and people driving delivery trucks on 6 county routes at 11 o'clock at night. She pushed through the doors. There was more work. There was always more work. She went to do it.